Chapter 22. Michael had fully intended to go right home. He knew his mother would have dinner ready by now, but he didn't feel much like eating. All he could think about was Joe. It troubled him that Joe hadn't told him about the gun sooner, about picking it up when Michael wasn't around. He wondered what else Joe might be hiding. That there was no telling what was going on in his mind anymore, no way to predict his behavior. He was a walking time bomb. Michael had begun to entertain the possibility that he wasn't a murderer after all. Maybe it had been Joe all along. Maybe Joe had shot the Winchester while Michael and Amy were in the garage. He thought back to that morning in July when they had first learned of Charlie Ward's death. He remembered how Joe had insisted that Michael hide the evidence, and how persistent he had been about not going to the police. Then he'd started talking about doing things he wasn't proud of. Michael wondered now what Joe had meant by that. Was it possible that he'd been talking about firing the gun that killed Charlie Ward and letting Michael believe it was his fault? Yet even as he tried to shift the blame to Joe, he knew in his heart that his friend hadn't done it. Even if Joe had fired the gun while Michael was in the garage with Amy, the bullet wouldn't have been the one that killed Charlie Ward. Michael and Amy had been together later in the afternoon, at least an hour after the accident had taken place. But it still looked bad for Joe. He couldn't keep the cops at bay with the same old story for much longer. Maybe they didn't have any hard proof yet, but it seemed pretty obvious they were working overtime to build a case of circumstantial evidence. Michael struggled to think straight. He needed to come up with a plan. He couldn't let Joe take the rap for Charlie Ward's death. Or could he? He knew that even though Joe hadn't done it, and even if it never came to trial for lack of evidence, most folks would think Joe was guilty anyway. People were like that sometimes. They had to have someone to blame. It would be the easiest thing in the world to let them believe what they wanted. It was the perfect setup, really, and he knew it. For a while, Michael wandered aimlessly up one street and down another with no particular destination in mind. That is, until he came to Amy Street. And as he rounded the corner and saw the small white house at the end of the road, he realized this was the one place where he had known the only moments of peace he had found that summer. Maybe he was kidding himself. Maybe it was hopeless. But he had to keep trying. The white Tercel sat in the driveway. Its new windshield caught the last rays of the setting sun. Michael stood looking at the car, remembering the day of the accident, and because he no longer expected anything, because he had lost all hope, he was not prepared for the touch of a hand on his shoulder, or, as he spun around, to find Amy standing behind him. He was so stunned he could barely breathe. Amy did not smile, and Michael thought he recognized something of his own pain and loneliness reflected in her face. He tipped his chin in the direction of the car. They got that fixed pretty fast. It was all he could think of to say. Amy looked over at the Tercel. Pappy's got friends in the business. Michael shoved his hands into his pockets and leaned against the car. Why did Joe do it? Smash your windshield, I mean. I don't know. Because he'd been drinking, I guess. Amy combed her fingers through her hair and stared down at her feet. Then she looked back at the house as if she were expecting someone to come through the door. You know, Amy paused and squeezed her eyes closed. She seemed unsure whether or not to continue. Then she looked him straight in the eye and said, Joe told me once why he'd brought me to your party. He said you wanted to get it on with me. He said I was his birthday present to you. Her eyes began to tear. Why would he say something like that? Michael's heart began to race. I don't know. Maybe because he was drunk when he told me, or maybe because it's true. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. I told you before, I didn't even know he was bringing you to my party. Amy watched him for a few seconds without saying anything, but we ended up in your garage anyway. Amy, so it was just about sex, right? He understood now that this was what Amy had been trying to find out that evening in the 7-Eleven parking lot a few days earlier. Look, Amy, I don't know what you want me to say. I mean, you looked so good in that bathing suit. Maybe it was about sex at first. I didn't know you then. But it isn't like that now, you know? I really care about you. He spread his hands. I'm sorry you had to go through this, with Darcy and all. It stinks, and I feel rotten about it. I don't know what else to say." Amy folded her arms and looked over at the windshield. Michael was still trying to understand why Joe would even tell Amy such a thing in the first place. Was he trying to get back at Michael because he felt Michael was letting him take all the blame for the accident? Did Joe really hate him that much? Michael felt so betrayed that he didn't care if Joe was accused of the murder. Let him take the blame. Nobody would take Joe's word over his. He didn't owe him anything anymore. Yet even when he attempted to transfer the burden of his guilt to Joe, he felt no relief. How could he wish this pain, the same pain he had lived with for almost 2 months, on a friend? Even if that friend had grown to hate him, he would he would not wish that on anyone. "The police were here this afternoon." Amy's soft voice floated up to him. Michael nodded his hands into fists and stared up at the sky. He did not dare look at Amy because he knew that her face would have the same open, trusting expression she always wore. "They're questioning everyone who was at my party." That's what they said. Michael jerked his thumb at the car. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Amy nodded. "I know," she whispered. She looked so beautiful standing there, with the light from the sunset spilling across her face. Michael desperately wanted to touch her, but he didn't dare. He knew he should probably leave. He'd done what he came for. He had apologized face to face. But he wanted more than that. He wanted them to be like they had been before, and there wasn't a thing he could say or do to make that happen. Amy turned to go. She was heading up the front walk, and he was doing nothing to stop her. "There's something you should know about me," Michael called after her. He felt his throat swell and wondered if he would be able to get the rest of the words out. "Something really rotten." Amy stopped and looked over her shoulder. She seemed to be searching his face. Then she said, her voice scarcely above a whisper, "I'm not the person you should be telling." Michael's blood went cold. His skin prickled with sweat. "What do you mean?" he said, terrified of what she was going to say. "I was there, remember? At your party, the day that shot was fired?" Michael's body had tipped slightly forward, as if he were waiting for her to strike him. "Yeah? I saw you come out of the woods with the rifle. Joe was with you." Tears had begun to form in the corner of her eyes. But I didn't really make the connection until I heard that the police were talking to the people who'd been at your party. Or maybe I did, but I didn't want to think about it." "You saw me?" Michael was so shocked, he couldn't think straight. Amy had seen him with the rifle, and like everyone else in town, she had known that Charlie Ward had been shot by a stray bullet on the 4th of July. Yet never once during all those weeks had she questioned him or judged him. He wondered if she had told the police what she had seen. If she had, they would have come to his house instead of Joe's. They would have taken him into custody as a major suspect, but that hadn't happened, at least not yet. If Amy had withheld critical information, that would make her an accessory too, like Joe. Michael cringed at the thought, but he couldn't bring himself to ask her outright what she had told the police. Michael leaned back against the tercel for support and covered his eyes with his hand. He could feel Joe's anger and resentment, and he would face the police when the time came. But Amy, who trusted and believed in him, that was something else. He wanted to die. He did not expect to feel Amy's arms around him, not ever again, but when she slipped her hands under his arms and began to stroke the back of his neck, all he could do was press his face into her hair and cry.